many of you will find on your newsstand a very rare special edition of Time magazine. That is the cover shot. There are, at least as when I saw it on my computer, now I'm not so sure, there are no words, there's no strong slug on it, just the date. It is not since August of '98, during the Lewinsky matter, has Time published a special edition. They'll publish again on Monday, as they always do, but they put that out, and that picture, I guess, is the one that I will confess I took to sleep with me last night.
I think we all did.
Yeah.
I think it's forever burned into our consciousness here. Aaron Brown and I both thank you for joining us tonight. That wraps it up for us this evening. Garrick Utley, Colleen McEdwards, and Jim Clancy will take you through the next hour. We, again, appreciate your joining us tonight. Good night.
Yeah.
A day after the stunning attacks on America, a sense of determination as New York City confronts the horror of Tuesday's terrorist attacks.
While investigators follow a trail of clues along the United States East Coast, searching for those responsible for the devastation.
And around the world, outpourings of grief for the victims and expressions of solidarity with the United States. Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Clancy.
And I'm Colleen McEdwards at the CNN Center. We want to bring you right up to date on the latest developments, of course, for you right here. Authorities in New York Wednesday evening evacuated two of the city's landmarks. They told people to leave both the Empire State Building and Penn Station. It's not clear yet why New York authorities took this action, but the all clear, we can tell you, was given just about 30 minutes ago. We'll continue to monitor that. Meanwhile, with their hands, with pickaxes, with whatever they can grab, rescuers dig slowly through the mounds of rubble, searching for survivors and human remains. At times, they're forced to retreat when sections of surrounding buildings buckle and crack. That actually happened Wednesday when what's left of the South Tower of the World Trade Center completely collapsed, as did 5 World Trade Center. Despite their efforts, only 9 survivors have been pulled from the wreckage so far. Still, firefighters, though, work on.
It's a lot of devastation, but we have to deal with it. It's something that we have to do. I mean, nobody really prepares for anything on this kind of scale. And, every news you hear is just more and more bad news.
In New York, leaders warn that the death toll from the collapse of the Twin Towers is sure to be heavy. Many people did manage to get out, but authorities fear that thousands remain under the piles of metal, stone, and dust. New York's mayor and governor appear undaunted.
We have to all work together now, and work together to make sure that we save as many lives as possible, rescue the people that we can rescue, and rebuild the city of New York and the World Trade Center to be even greater and more wonderful and more beautiful than it was before.
We're going to show the rest of the nation, we're going to show the rest of the world that the New Yorkers are not intimidated by terrorism, that we don't surrender to this type of cowardly act, but we will come back stronger than ever.
And citywide, Mayor Giuliani says that the death toll officially standing at 82, expected, though, of course, to go much higher.
At the same time this day, U.S. President George W. Bush taking a close-up view of the devastation at the Pentagon for himself. Mr. Bush made the short trip to the sprawling building just outside Washington Wednesday. After meeting with rescue personnel, he stared silently at the huge gash left by the plane's impact.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
As Mr. Bush stood nearby, workers unfurled a large American flag and began singing, "God Bless America." Now on to one of the areas of this story people are most interested in, the investigation. No arrests yet, but in Boston, the FBI taking several people in for questioning. Boston is a focus for investigators because 2 of the 4 hijacked commercial flights originated there. Agents have also taken into custody several people in Providence, Rhode Island, as well as Venice and Vero Beach, Florida. Authorities searched 2 residents in Vero Beach, where they say 2 brothers possibly involved in the hijackings may have lived.
The Department of Justice has undertaken perhaps the most massive and intensive investigation ever conducted in America. The full resources of the FBI, the Justice Department's Criminal Division, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the INS, and other components have been brought to bear and will be focused in this endeavor.
The Bush administration still considering how to respond to the terror attacks. President Bush huddled with his national security team Wednesday. Pressure building on the Bush administration to strike back and strike back soon. But top aides say the battle against terrorism will take a long-term commitment from the entire world.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end.
U.S. military advisors are refusing to provide any details of whether a military strike is being planned, but Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld warning U.S. servicemen and women to be on the alert.
We are, in a sense, seeing the definition of a new battlefield in the world, a 21st century battlefield. And it is a different kind of conflict. It is something that is not unique to this century, to be sure, but it is, given our geography and given our circumstance, it is in a major sense new for this country.
Now, at the same time, Colleen, congressional leaders are telling CNN lawmakers and the White House have begun work on a so-called use of force resolution. But they add several key leaders are raising concerns that the measure could be seen as a blank check authorizing military action.
International support key as well here, and President Bush and his top aides also spent much of the day trying to line up international support for the U.S. response to the attacks, and they did get a good deal of it. At an emergency meeting in Brussels, NATO made a decision that could pave the way for a collective response to the carnage.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
And NATO's decision marks the first time in the 52-year history of the alliance that the Mutual Defense Clause has actually been invoked. Meantime, Germany says it wants to repay the United States for its past support.
When the freedom of Berlin was at stake, John F. Kennedy said, you know the famous sentence, Ich bin ein Berliner. That was the expression of an incredible solidarity. Today, I think we have reason, especially as Germans, to return this show of solidarity. We stand in solidarity with the American people.
The U.S. financial markets are going to remain closed until at least Friday. The leaders of the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission cite the destruction in downtown Manhattan for that delay. However, the U.S. Treasury will resume trading on Thursday. Meantime, thousands of travelers are waiting for commercial air travel to actually get going again. Federal officials have announced the limited resumption of commercial flights, but they say they need more time to put strict new security measures into effect. They include a total ban on knives and an end to curbside and off-airport check-ins. Also, only ticketed passengers with photo ID will be allowed past airport metal detectors, done that way in several other countries. Aviation officials say they don't expect passenger travel to return to normal before Thursday evening Eastern time. That is at the earliest, we're told. Jim?
Now, even at this moment, a day and a half or more after that first jetliner slammed into the World Trade Center, the full story of the attack on the United States is really only beginning to take shape. We now have stories of survival. We have stories of struggle. CNN's Garrick Utley joins us once again, surveying the skyline of a wounded city. Garrick.
Indeed, Jim, it is still a wounded city. New York City, particularly Manhattan here around us, has begun to come back halfway to life this afternoon and even this evening. Mayor Giuliani and others are predicting that by tomorrow life should be as normal as it can be, except for the lower part of the island there along New York Harbor where the attack took place. And as we try to still handle and absorb the shocks of the attack itself on Tuesday, there are the aftershocks, perhaps not so surprisingly, fears of new bomb attacks. In fact, false alarms, perhaps even hoaxes. One of these occurred just right below us here along 34th Street in Midtown Manhattan this evening. A bomb alert or warning was received by security officials, and suddenly 34th Street, a busy crosstown thoroughfare, was the scene of all kinds of police and fire department action. Units were brought in, the cars and pedestrians were cleared out from almost the Hudson River on the west to Madison Avenue on the east. That's where securing the area around the Empire State Building. And not only the Empire State Building, but also nearby Penn Station, one of the main transportation hubs in Manhattan. The alert was also valid for that center. Passengers were not only rushed out of the terminal, some passengers, we are told, were told to get out of their trains and flee. But after about 1 hour, it was indeed a false alarm, and 34th Street is being reopened to traffic once again. And perhaps it's not surprising that these kinds of hoaxes, some kinds of people with these ideas will be calling these in. Of course, the police have to respond, which makes it much more difficult for them to deal with the real trouble and tragedy further downtown. And downtown is our correspondent Michael Oku, who has a vantage point near where the World Trade Centers once stood and can tell us what's going on there, how the rescue efforts are proceeding. Michael?
Garrett, good evening. As you can see, I am standing in front of what used to be the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. If you look over my shoulder, you will see that it's now just a very, very blooming cloud of smoke. You can smell some of the remnants. People say that it's material, obviously, that came from the building and from some of the smoke down on the ground level. There are helicopters flying overhead. One must imagine that they have to do with the rescue efforts, and some of the authorities are surveying the scene here. Mayor Giuliani, as you correctly said, has said that tomorrow life will go back to normal, but he has said it is still pretty much a state of emergency south of 14th Street in Lower Manhattan. The police barricades that had stretched all across 14th Street, which basically divides Lower Manhattan from the rest of the city. He also mentioned what are some very grim numbers. When you talk about stories like this, you will always talk about the numbers, and we will be talking about the numbers for the weeks ahead. As we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, Colleen mentioned 82 victims found, 18 of which have been identified. So you can do the quick arithmetic on that. That means, of course, grimly, that 64 bodies have not been identified. It's unclear whether any of those bodies or all of those bodies will ever be identified. Of course, that's speculation at this point. We will get, hopefully, clearer information on that in the days ahead. And also very difficult to digest, but unfortunately a harsh reality in a story like this. Authorities at the scene at the mayor's press conference today, after the press conference, told me that also 37 body parts were found. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani confirmed tonight that the city has requested 6,000 body bags from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that 3,000 tons of debris had been found from the site. Again, very grim numbers, and I'm sure that we will continue talking about those numbers in the days ahead. Garrett?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. As the rescue work continues, we're also receiving new images, new scenes of what was happening at the time, shortly after the explosion. And these are pictures of the downtown area, some of the rescue efforts that were taking place, some of the looks like a bulldozer there trying to move an ambulance or a police department vehicle. These are some of the efforts. It's not just the rubble up from the buildings itself, but we see again the destruction. This again an amateur video which was made today and courtesy of Mr. Bauer, who took them. Again, it shows part of the mosaic, the destruction there. And as we have been seeing over and hearing over the last day or two, there have been any number of stories from those who were in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center when those two planes crashed into them. And in addition to the stories of how they escaped, there's another angle, there's another important element. What led these people to flee? And what led apparently a great number of workers in the Twin Towers to stay exactly where they were once those planes crashed into the building, into the World Trade Center? How did they make these decisions, and why did they? That's part of the report now from our correspondent, Maria Hinojosa.
The onlookers, safe behind police barricades, release their emotions through applause for the rescue workers. But for the survivors who were closer to ground zero, mixed emotions.
I saw my family, my wife and the 2 kids. Baby that's 1 year old and the 4-year-old. And I just saw them and I was just running towards the light.
Benjamin Fogel was right outside the building when it imploded. So survivors come to terms with what gave them the strength to make it out.
The plane is making impact. It's just coming in, and it's like shattered glass. Multiply the sum by 1 billion.
Judith Francis escaped through some back door steps.
And like, don't look back, don't look up, just keep going, don't run. It felt like a thunder of elephants just coming.
Many survivors spent yesterday in shock. Today, for some, that shock gave way to anger.
If I made it from 105th floor, many, many more people could have made it down. And Port Authority was announcing over the speaker over and over again, everything is fine, we are secure.
In the wreckage, she may have lost dozens of co-workers.
People had a chance to get out, and people went and sat back down and went up to get their purse and went back, for silly things.
Downtown near Ground Zero, Maureen Raffoni tries to make it to her apartment just 1 block away from where the tower stood, with no luck.
So you're looking at not going home for 2 or 3 days?
She feels guilty these days for everything.
You don't want to be narcissistic, and be like, oh, my belongings, oh, my apartment is trashed. The reality is I'm alive, and those poor people that didn't get out, I pray for them.
As the rescue workers file in, hoping against hope for more survivors, those who did make it through move into numbness.
I can't find words to describe it anymore. It's just the pain that I feel inside. I can't really label it.
For the survivors, theirs is a gift of life, but it's a gift wrapped in pain and sorrow. How could they have survived when so many others didn't? Maria Hinojosa, CNN, New York.
And once again, that eternal question of why, and for many, the question of why did I decide to flee, or why did I decide to stay? Questions being asked by so many people, above all the loved ones, the family and friends of those who were lost or at least are trapped at the World Trade Center site. Back to you now in Atlanta, Jim.
Garrick, just to chat with you a little bit and ask you, we see there the obvious pain, the wonderment at having survived such a disaster. But we also saw this day a lot of resolve on the part of New Yorkers, a band of people that, more than perhaps many others around the world, have a tendency to stick together in times of challenge.
That's true, and of course there's been this popular image of the tough New Yorker, the can-do New Yorker, at times rather obnoxious perhaps, but that's supposed to be this metropolis's characteristic. And one of the reasons for it is the sheer density of this city, particularly for an American city. Manhattan, the center of New York City, obviously is an island. There are bridges going out on the Hudson River, the East River. People really live here in dormitory living. We live in cubicles and cells, if you will. And if you're going to live that close together, 2 things happen, Jim. One is you run up against each other and you become very abrasive. On the other hand, you realize that you are part of a community. There's no big backyard. There's no backyard fence or a driveway separating your place from the next place, like much of American suburbia, for example. And I think this goes a long way to explaining why people in New York City, particularly here in Manhattan, stick together, work together, and that's what they're continuing to do tonight and obviously for many days ahead.
All right, Gary Cutley, thank you for that. Colleen.
All right, Jim. Well, CNN has learned that a microphone was actually left open on the hijacked flight that crashed in rural Pennsylvania, and we have obtained a partial transcript of what air traffic ground control heard taking place inside that cockpit. While United Airlines Flight 93 is 35,000 feet over the Cleveland area, shouting is heard in that cockpit. Someone yells, "Get out of here." The microphone's turned off. It comes back on. Some scuffling is heard, and a voice again yells, "Get out of here." The microphone again turned off, and then when it's turned on once again, someone is heard speaking English in what is described to us as an Arabic accent, tells passengers this: "There is a bomb on board. This is the captain speaking. Remain in your seat. There is a bomb on board. Stay quiet. We are meeting their demands. We are returning to the airport." And the microphone then goes off as the doomed plane heads into Pittsburgh airspace. That into CNN. Well, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is conducting a massive operation throughout the U.S. The FBI Wednesday took several people into custody in Boston and Florida for questioning. Now, these people have not been arrested, or they're not even being described as suspects at this point, but authorities say that they could provide what they call important material information related to the attacks. Meanwhile, the FBI says it believes at least 4 hijackers were capable of flying a plane. CNN's Mike Betcher has more on that.
From Maine to Florida, the investigation moved quickly along the eastern seaboard.
We have, in the last 24 hours, taken the manifests and used those as an evidentiary base, and have talked to many of the families of the victims, and have successfully, I believe, identified many of the hijackers on each of the 4 flights that went down.
Federal investigators now believe they know the identity of 4 men capable of piloting the 2 planes that left Boston and crashed into the World Trade Center. The key, rental cars parked by the suspected terrorist at Portland International Airport and Boston's Logan Airport, each yielding clues that ultimately led investigators to flight schools in Florida.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
Rental records for the car left in Portland brought investigators to residences in Vero Beach, Florida, which were searched by the FBI. Inside one house, pictures of Adnan Bukhari and a pilot certificate from a Florida flight school in his name. Also found inside the residence, another pilot certificate for Amir Abbas Bukhari. Another certificate indicates that at least one of the Bukharis participated in a program to help train Saudi Airlines employees. Federal investigators believe the 2 men are brothers and prime suspects. FBI agents also visited other Florida locations after gathering clues from the second rental car parked at Boston's Logan Airport that led to the identity of 2 more men, also pilots, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi, who received at least some flight training at Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida. Charles Voss is a bookkeeper at Huffman Aviation who briefly allowed the 2 men to stay at his house.
They were, like I said, students, and they arrived over there a year ago. It was in last July. And when they first arrived, they had no place to stay. They just popped in pretty much, as I recall, unannounced. And so we provided them, for the benefit of the flight school, provided them a place to stay for a few days.
At least one person believed to be an acquaintance of the Bukharis has been taken into custody for questioning.
There have been occasions where we have interviewed individuals and come to find that the individual is out of status, and that individual has been detained on an immigration hold. But there have been no arrests relating to these hijackings at this point.
Having found the 4 men, federal investigators believe piloted the 2 hijacked jets into the World Trade Center towers. They are now scouring Florida flight schools, searching for the pilots of the other 2 jetliners, one that crashed in Pennsylvania, the other that rammed the Pentagon. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Congress and the White House are weighing their options on how to respond to Tuesday's attack. CNN's John King is covering this story from the White House. He joins us now live. John.
Jim, negotiations proceeding and progress being made, we are told, on two fronts. First and foremost, CNN getting details tonight of negotiations between the White House and key congressional leaders on what they are calling a resolution of resolve. But this resolution, we are told, includes language, and again, they're still negotiating the final document, but it includes language that would back the president in using force to retaliate for these deadly terrorist strikes. The negotiations went on late tonight, the White House faxing at some points proposed language to key members of Congress. We're told those talks will pick up in the morning. The president also making progress, we are told, in negotiating agreement on a $20 billion emergency spending bill. That could reach the White House as early as tomorrow afternoon. That would be a down payment on the money to pay first and foremost for the recovery and rescue efforts we see in New York and over at the Pentagon, and to pay for the early stages of the investigation. Jim?
Through the last years, there's been a sense that there's a terrorist threat that is looming there, and certainly the Bush administration has talked about that with its missile defense and everything else. It has pushed sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and other things. Is there a sense at the White House that the clock has run out on some of these options?
There certainly is, and again, there's both a short-term and a long-term prescription. Looking far down the road, we hear administration officials and especially key members of Congress saying the United States needs to go back to the drawing board, learn some lessons from this, find out what went wrong, and perhaps spend billions more not only on tougher airport security, but on human intelligence at the CIA, at the FBI, and at other law enforcement agencies. In the short term, Mr. Bush now trying to do something his father did when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Mr. Bush called more than a half dozen international leaders today. Secretary of State Colin Powell making efforts as well, trying to form what the White House is calling a broad international coalition against terrorism, hoping not only to have broad international support if and when the president decides to respond to these particular attacks, but also White House officials saying hopefully to bring some good from this catastrophe to create a sustained effort to go after suspected terrorists with military force if necessary, but also to get nations around the world to crack down and shun other nations that provide harbor or financial support to suspected terrorist groups. Jim?
You spoke earlier about some of the technicalities of obtaining the permission for the use of military force. How much coordination, how much support is there for the president? Are there sticking points?
Well, there are always sticking points whenever there is a proposal or a prospect of using force. Some in the Congress believe that Congress has to authorize it. The commander-in-chief always defends presidential prerogative, that he is the commander-in-chief and that the president can act to use force. So what the president hopes for here is to get language backing him, authorizing the use of force. He does not want to go to the Congress and say he needs the permission of the Congress, but what he would like, not only to show the American people there is broad bipartisan support for this, but to show other nations around the world that there is unity in the United States on this point. He would like, much like the Congress unanimously passed a resolution today condemning these acts, much like President Bush, the former President Bush, won support for his actions against Saddam Hussein, this president would like the United States Congress to be on record saying, Mr. President, if you come to a conclusive conclusion about who is responsible for this, please use force and retaliate.
All right, John King reporting there live from the White House. Colleen?
Jim, well, President Bush got a first-hand look Wednesday at the devastating blow suffered by the Pentagon, the site of the third terrorist strike. And for that story now, we turn to CNN's Jamie McIntyre, who's there for us. Jamie?
Colleen, President Bush did come by here at the Pentagon about 5:30 this afternoon to take a look at the huge gaping hole that was left when that American Airlines jetliner slammed into the side of the Pentagon. He thanked many of the firefighters and rescue workers and FBI agents personally for the hard work that they've been doing over the last 2 days. And as sort of a moment of high symbolism, some of the firefighters and other workers unfurled a huge American flag from the roof of the Pentagon, hung it down over the front of the facade as a symbol that they had gotten the fire under control and that the Pentagon was continuing to work as usual. But even though the firefighters finally did get that fire under control, they are now pretty much giving up hope of finding any more survivors.
There are still some smoldering embers in the rubble that was once the Navy wedge of the Pentagon, seen here in a commercial satellite photograph. But after more than 24 hours, the fire was basically out. The intense heat and smoky blaze that resulted from a fully fueled jetliner crashing into the building convinced Pentagon officials that anyone who might have survived the initial impact could not have survived the fire. The death toll, feared to be as high as 800, now looks as though it may be just over 200, including the 64 people on the plane.
From everything that we currently know, the estimate that's been widely reported is considerably high, and we certainly pray that that's the case.
The attack penetrated 3 of the Pentagon's 5 rings, and the fire spread through the wooden roof. For now, roughly 1/2 of the Pentagon is closed, sealed off by armed sentries posted at all 5 rings on all 5 floors. Now the search is for evidence. FBI agents lined up to slowly comb the area, looking for pieces of plane wreckage. It will take months, if not years, to repair the damage to the Pentagon. And thousands of Pentagon workers, including the chiefs of the Army and Navy, have been relocated to temporary offices. In a recorded message to U.S. troops, Secretary Rumsfeld again hinted military retaliation is coming.
It is my duty as head of this department to tell you that more, much more, will be asked of you in the weeks and months ahead. This is especially true of those who are in the field. We face powerful and terrible enemies, enemies we intend to vanquish, so that moments of horror, like yesterday, will be stopped.
So far, the only military deployments are defensive. An aircraft carrier off the coast of New York is one of dozens of ships patrolling the east and west coasts. Air National Guard planes are flying protective cover over major U.S. cities.
Rumsfeld warned that a military campaign against terrorists and their supporters will be neither quick nor easy. It will take, he said, a sustained and broadly based effort. Will it work, he was asked? His reply, only time will tell. Colleen?
All right, CNN's Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon tonight. Thanks. Jim?
Attorney General John Ashcroft calls the probe into Tuesday's attacks the most massive and intensive investigation in American history. As David Inser reports, U.S. officials apparently have already made some significant progress.
U.S. officials say on the passenger manifests of the hijacked planes used in the attacks, they found names associated with terrorist groups. Intelligence officials say the evidence still points to the al-Qaeda group, headed by Osama bin Laden.
There had to be some brains behind this. We have some good, promising leads. They're obviously being followed.
Publicly, the Bush administration is accusing no one so far, while warning nations they too will pay for any help given to those who attacked New York and Washington.
We will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Afghanistan's Taliban government has long offered haven to bin Laden, but U.S. officials say they have no evidence thus far of any state directly assisting the attacks in New York and Washington. Many analysts argue that such a coordinated broadside could not have been possible without it.
Osama bin Laden represents a complete terrorist network. He will have one or more state sponsors, countries that he's either based in or working in collusion with. There'll have been passport support, communication support.
One thing I think that ought to make us a bit suspicious about whether bin Laden was involved in it alone or not is that he goes to great lengths to advertise himself. And when you see something like that, you begin to wonder whether or not there may be an effort to draw our attention solely to him, to the neglect of someone who may be his principal contractor.
If there was state support, a number of terrorism experts point to Iraq as the most likely suspect. A statement from President Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television said, quote, "The United States reaps the thorns that its rulers have sown in the world."
U.S. officials say they are developing good law enforcement and intelligence leads. They do not know yet who was behind these attacks, nor whether any state assisted them. But they believe they soon will. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
The Justice Department's Office of Victims of Crime has set up a hotline. We've got some numbers for you now. For tips that may help thwart terrorist acts, you can call 800-483-5137. Families and relatives of those who are missing since the attack can call this number, 1-800-331-0075. Well, Wall Street remained closed Wednesday, but trading is currently underway in Asia. Maggie Lake is in our New York bureau with the latest numbers from Asian trading. A heck of a sell-off yesterday, Maggie. Has it stabilized at all today?
Colleen, there are some early, very encouraging signs. Obviously, global markets are still grappling with the devastation that rocked the U.S. on Tuesday. In particular, Wall Street, the financial nerve center of the U.S. Asian markets, as you said, are now open. And as I said, early indications show some modest gains across the board. It's a big relief. Yesterday, Asian markets fell sharply. Tokyo's Nikkei dropped over 6.5%, its lowest close since December 1983. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong declined 8.8%. That was its lowest close since 1999. But of course, they were the first to react to the unbelievable news of the attack on New York and Washington. Europe had a little bit more time to digest it and was able to push higher. That helped shore up sentiment, and today may indeed lend some support to Asian markets. If we take a look right now how those markets are trading, after a 30-minute delay at the Nikkei, this is the second day in a row we've seen that, it is actually just turned down. It was positive at the very open, it's down, but just fractionally. The Hong Kong Hang Seng is trading up more than 1%, and the Singapore Straits Times also trading up just marginally. Of course, the decision had already been made that U.S. equity markets will remain closed on Thursday. The destruction and actual infrastructure challenges are behind the decision.
Operational readiness of individual firms. As Harvey has said, we've examined the issues of communication, power, safety and soundness of structures in the lower Manhattan area, and certainly access to those structures for the people who operate our firms. We are committed that the equity markets will resume operations no later than Monday. The group that gathered today will gather again tomorrow, with the idea that we may well be in a position to resume trading as early as Friday.
Many analysts and market participants are really driving that point home today. That is not concern about the stability of markets, but rather logistics that are behind the delay. They feel it is a very important distinction to make. Well, we've all seen the pictures. The destruction is immense, and no one knows that better than Morgan Stanley Dean Witter. They were the largest tenant in the World Trade Center, 3,500 employees spread out on 22 floors. Many miraculously have been accounted for, but the search still continues, and obviously the offices are decimated. Despite this, the company's CEO has come out and said they will be open for business.
All of the financial systems internally and externally are working. So the country is strong. The financial system is very strong and resilient, and your company is extremely strong and very proud of its people. Bob?
Now, if you wonder how it's possible, many companies have disaster contingency plans in place. Many of them were actually shored up with the approach of Y2K and fears of the millennium bug. IBM, SunGard, and ComDisco are the three biggest players in that area. They have systems that replicate data and files, and they kick in and take over when something like this hits. ComDisco, for one, today saying it is handling operations for about 30 clients. In a way, many are saying now that the non-event of Y2K was maybe the best thing that ever happened. It helped cause these kinds of safeguards to be put in place and tested. Of course, financial regulators also urging this, and it's paid off, certainly. Now, it is important to stress many of the companies are rolling up their sleeves in the face of enormous personal loss, and it is not just in New York. Across the country, the financial community has lost colleagues and friends, but the response has been the same. Brokers and fund managers were in work today. Bank of America, which had offices in the World Trade Center, A.G. Edwards, the list goes on. All of them hit the phones, talking to clients, to investors, answering their questions, telling them to have patience and not to panic. Also, we've seen an incredible show of solidarity, and not by those directly that were not impacted. Amazon.com turned over its homepage to the American Red Cross to accept donations. GE has said it will donate $10 million. Cisco donated $4 million, both to the rebuilding and rescue efforts. Bank America donated $1 million to the September 11th fund, which helps the victims. Also, banks Wells Fargo and Wachovia are donating, and I'm sure that list will continue to grow in the days ahead. Colleen?
Maggie, there have been reports of talk of price gouging. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. Today there were some reports, mostly coming from the Midwest, of isolated cases of what seems to be individual gas station owners bumping up the price of gasoline, sometimes to as much as $4 or $5 a gallon. It was sort of a knee-jerk reaction. The oil companies, including ExxonMobil, immediately came out and said they were holding prices steady. Some of the station owners actually said in the wake of that they would give rebates to customers they overcharged, and the Automobile Association of America urged against exploiting the situation.
Consumers should not panic. They should remain calm. Our supplies are fine at this point. There's no need to form long gas lines and thinking that our supplies are going to run out.
In New York City, there were also some reports of price gouging, but again, they seem to be the exception. I have to say, I have been in and around the city for the last 2 days. I live here, and what I have seen has been just the opposite. People were giving out free pizza to people who were stranded yesterday, offering cars to people who needed transport, giving out free water. I was in the grocery store today. The prices were normal. People were orderly. Restaurants were keeping their doors open. So it seems that these are very isolated cases in what is a very difficult situation. Colleen?
Maggie, in comments earlier by Mayor Rudy Giuliani seeming to support that, saying things are going well, not a lot of looting, not a lot of problems. So thanks very much for your report. Jim?
All right, Colleen, let's turn our attention once again to the streets of New York. Our Garrick Utley is there, and we'll take his view. Garrick?
Well, Jim, we want to check up on something that's been happening in Lower Manhattan around the site of the disaster all day and into the night. A rather nervous waiting and watching game as to whether yet another building may collapse there. This one, of course, is at One Liberty Plaza near the site of the Twin Towers. We want to speak now with the president and CEO of Brookfield Properties, Bruce Flatt. That's the company which owns the building. Good evening, Mr. Flatt. What can you tell us about the status, the safety, the integrity of your building tonight?
Firstly, what I'd like to say is most of the reports that have been reported on the news are wrong, and how that information got out, we don't know. But we've been working with authorities, including the mayor's office and the governor's office, for the last 2 days since this started. We've had, since early this morning, engineers and people in One Liberty Plaza and in the World Financial Center downtown, which are our properties. And we've done preliminary technical work and investigation with structural engineers, and we have no structural damage in the buildings, including One Liberty Plaza. So
well, tell us, sir.
Hello?
Please, yes, Mr. Flatt, can I just ask you to get some specifics? Give us an idea of how high is this building? How many floors? What's the size?
Jerry Larkin's telling me it's 54 stories, and it is 2.2 million square feet. It's a large building, but I spent personally 3 hours in the building today. We had all of our senior people down there, including the former First Deputy Mayor, John Zuccotti, and we were through the building. We've had structural engineers, in fact, 2 firms through the building, including the fire department, who's given it we've talked to them and let people back into the buildings, and there are no issues with the building at the current time. And there's been no partial collapses reported on the newscast.
So the structural...
The thing that we're worried about, firstly, is people, and secondly, which is our tenants. And what I'd like to say to our tenants is that there is no issues as reported on the news in the last.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Flatt, for being with us and giving us that update on the structural integrity of your building there at One Liberty Plaza. Throughout the day, of course, we've been hearing statements from the Bush administration that when the investigation does pinpoint who or which organizations were responsible for these terrorist attacks, the United States will take direct, immediate action, unilateral action. The United States will do what it deems fit and proper as a response. And yet, of course, there is also the wider international community. Now, leaders of various nations, as we've heard, have been supporting the United States, expressing their official sympathy. Here in New York City, of course, we have the headquarters of the United Nations. What does the UN as a symbol of the international community think? What are the legal ramifications with me? And joining us this evening here in New York is Shashi Tharoor, who is the head of the Public Information Office at the UN. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, what has the United Nations done in terms of taking an official position vis-a-vis what happened here in Lower Manhattan?
It's reacted immediately, first of all, with the Secretary General's condemnation as soon as it happened, and the Security Council's action. Today, both the Security Council and the General Assembly, today Wednesday, adopted unanimous resolutions expressing horror and revulsion at what had happened and pledging to assist the United States to bring the perpetrators to justice. In fact, when the Security Council voted in an unprecedented gesture, the members of the Council stood up instead of raising their hands to vote. It was an act that symbolized the world standing behind the United States.
These words, these resolutions, of course, are very encouraging, very supportive. But when it comes to the action itself, one of the key issues President Bush has raised in the speech from the White House the other night is that we, that is the Americans, the United States, will not distinguish between the terrorist groups themselves and any government which might be harboring or sheltering these terrorist groups. Now, obviously, everybody's talking about Afghanistan. What is the United Nations position on this? Do you make a distinction?
Well, every single government of the United Nations is behind these two resolutions. The Security Council and the General Assembly have both spoken with one voice, and that simply means that these people, these perpetrators, have no place to hide. There is no government on earth that is prepared to say that it is willing to shelter these people. We come from every part of the world of the United Nations, but we are all New Yorkers today.
So if the investigation leads to conclusive evidence or credible evidence that this was Osama bin Laden's organization, that it is located in Afghanistan, and the White House decides to go after Afghanistan, that would be appropriate action in the UN's view based on these resolutions?
Well, the Security Council has expressed its readiness to take its responsibilities under the Charter, its responsibilities for peace and security, and take all necessary steps in this regard, which does mean, it seems to me, that if the United States were to come with evidence and ask the Security Council to support certain kinds of action, it's bound to get a very sympathetic hearing.
Finally, perhaps a bottom line opinion as to what the United Nations thinks of the situation in Afghanistan. What is the status of your personnel there? We understand that they're being pulled out.
We have pulled our people out of Afghanistan. It's a situation which in any case has been rather fraught. Independent of anything related to this tragedy, we have, as you know, had war going on, explosions in Kabul recently. We judged it was not safe for our personnel to remain, and we have pulled them out.
Americans, I think, and people around the world have heard voices for many years coming from the United Nations in crises such as this, conflicts such as this, not as a diplomat, but as a man who's Indian, lived in Europe, the United Kingdom, here in the United States these days. How do you react to this personally, as a senior official at the UN?
Not just as a senior official, but as somebody who's lived in New York. I grieve with my fellow New Yorkers. All of us feel very, very deeply the pain that this city has suffered. For us, this is not just a blow on New York, not just an attack on America. It's an attack on the bonds of humanity that unite us all. And certainly no one of the United Nations would have anything but the strongest rejection of what has happened here.
Shashi Tharoor with the United Nations, thank you for joining us this evening. That's it now from New York, and back to Colleen.
Garrick, thanks very much. Well, U.S. medical officials say that massive voluntary donations have provided enough blood for the victims of the attack at this point. But remember that blood can only be kept stored for no more than 42 days, so more may be needed in 2 to 8 weeks. If you are willing to donate blood, please contact the Red Cross at 1-888-HELP-NOW. There's the number for you. Well, at some places, people waited in line for hours just to give blood right across the country. Bonnie Anderson reports now from a donation center in Atlanta.
A day of compassion and patriotism. American flags for American citizens reaching out to aid injured countrymen.
Like many Americans, I just wanted to come out and do something and give back in a very tangible way.
I'll take the next person in line, please. On an average day, 10 people walk into Life South Community Center in Atlanta. Since the attacks, hundreds have come, responding to a local radio station's call for help and experiencing a broad range of emotion.
I have family up there. It was hard to get in touch with everybody, and scared that it could happen anywhere. Very scared.
Exhausted staff members working as much as 14 hours a day, inspired by the crowds.
I've been tired, but yet they have been spending about 5-6 hours waiting to give some blood. So I get my encouragement from them.
Go ahead and put pressure there for me. Hold your arms straight up in the air. And people are just willing to donate today. And that's great that they're coming out.
This means a lot of work for you.
Yeah, but we enjoy it. It's definitely going to a good cause.
It takes 24 hours to process the blood. At that point, it could go to New York, Washington, D.C., or to any hospital nationwide accepting victims of the attacks. For Karen Skidmore, that chance to save a life made this visit to a blood center even more meaningful.
This is my first time. I'm sorry, this is just really emotional for me. And I just wanted to do something, and this is all I could think of that I could do other than pray. So.
Bonnie Anderson, CNN, Atlanta.
Let's turn our attention now to the situation in the skies over the United States. Commercial air travel resuming in the United States, but only on a very limited basis. Authorities decided to allow some flights so that stranded airline passengers would be allowed to return to their homes. The Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says the general ground stop should continue at least until the airports are able to implement new security measures. Officials want to implement a total ban on knives, including plastic ones. Only butter knives will be allowed for in-flight meals. There will be no more curbside check-in or check-ins at sites away from the airport. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past airport metal detectors. The government wants to set higher standards for airport security personnel and put more federal air marshals on duty at large airports. Well, for many travelers, the effects of the airline ground stop were immediate, and they are still being felt. Thousands of air passengers remain stranded at airports, often in unfamiliar cities. All four of the hijacked aircraft were originally destined for California. And that's where we find CNN's Frank Buckley. He's at the Los Angeles International Airport, in other lingo, LAX. Frank?
Jim, we are at a still deserted and closed LAX in Los Angeles, a very eerie sight here at an airport that is very busy. On a normal day, some 160,000 passengers will either fly in or out of LAX. Today, not a single passenger was allowed to fly in or out of this airport. This evening, however, we did encounter some passengers off-site at an off-site parking lot. They arrived by bus. These were passengers who flew in from Osaka, Japan yesterday. They were attempting to fly into Los Angeles and were instead diverted to San Francisco. After overnighting there, they learned that they would not be able to fly on to Los Angeles today, so they boarded buses and made the 8-hour drive to Los Angeles. They were the lucky ones because now at least they are in their final destination. Others were not so lucky. We encountered a number of passengers stranded here at LAX, including one man that we met who is from Nutley, New Jersey.
Nutley's about 5 miles from Manhattan. My home actually had a view of the Trade Center. We don't have the view anymore. Somebody came in and took it away. And my family and the families back here are very upset. I'm sure 6 degrees removed, we know someone who knows someone who's no longer with us because what these people did to the United States. And I just really miss them. I want to get back to my family and be with them, going through what they're going through.
There were heartwarming stories as well of people pulling together. We met up with a group of 4 stranded passengers. The airlines they flew on didn't provide them with accommodations, although one kind employee from Southwest Airlines did provide them with some food and drink. Last night, however, they had to pool their resources together, and they found a motel room here locally. 4 strangers brought together by an awful circumstance, now friends who've camped in together at a motel.
She snores.
You sort of see. It was fun. I mean, you tried, the other girl and I, after he left, I go, what are we doing? I mean, we don't know who's who, if they're murders or whatever, but we got to trust our instincts and stay together, try to help each other.
People trying to keep a sense of humor and trying to pull together under a difficult circumstance. Tomorrow, some flights, some of the diverted international flights that were diverted to Canada are expected to arrive here at Los Angeles, possibly as early as 8 or 9 tomorrow morning here local time in California. Airport officials say they still don't know yet, however, if any planes will be allowed to depart with any of the stranded passengers here in Los Angeles. Jim.
One of the things that you have to notice from all of this, Frank, is the attitude of the passengers. There is not the anger that you would probably expect in this situation or at any other reason.
Yeah, and we noticed that yesterday. People were very patiently waiting in line. When people have their flights canceled, often you see frayed nerves, you see people yelling at some of the airline employees. Didn't see that at all yesterday. People were simply patiently waiting. They knew the circumstances, they knew why they were in this position, and they were very patient about it. Today we did see people getting a little more anxious about the situation because of information that was suggesting that they should be here at a certain time, then later, no, you don't need to be here because the flights aren't taking off. So we might start to see a little more frustration, but in general, I would agree with you, Jim, that people were very patient. It was not the normal sort of passenger who's very upset about having their flights canceled.
All right, Frank Buckley reporting to us there live from Los Angeles International Airport. Colleen.
And ditto, Jim, for people who've seen schools closed, other events canceled in their communities, people being very patient about it. Also, many major events around the world are being canceled or postponed in the aftermath of these attacks. The United Nations General Assembly decided Wednesday to put off next week's Children's Summit in New York. And officials at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank say they may cancel their annual meeting. That's set for the end of this month in Washington. Sweden is calling off this weekend's summit of leaders from 14 nations. Even baseball, sport long considered the ultimate U.S. pastime, is on hold. All major league games set for Wednesday have been canceled.
Well, people all around the world, some of them watching this broadcast, all trying to deal with the grief stemming from the attacks. After all, there are many international victims here. I think Britain is expecting maybe as many as 200. Japan also looking at perhaps a high death toll coming out of this.
Yeah, that's right. Some 46 countries had offices in that World Trade Center. It's especially hard, though, for Americans living abroad as well. Jim Bitterman has more now from Paris.
4,000 miles and an ocean away, worshippers in these distant pews were in no less shock than if they had been looking on from the streets of Lower Manhattan. In this globalized world with its globalized terror, you can be an American in Paris and be just as grief-stricken. Churchmen knew people came to grieve together and used the moment to warn against letting the wrong emotions carry the day.
Yes, we need to go find these people, and we need to deal with them with justice, not out of mindless vengeance and hatred to repay them, but because we, Americans, we don't live like that.
In the end, it was more than just the shared empathy Americans do. Those whose lives led them to Paris are often exactly the sort of people who know New York, who know Washington, and fear for friends left behind. Expatriated, but still patriots, some of whom believe their homeland has been too disengaged from world affairs.
I really hope that it brings us out of isolation. You cannot make peace worldwide. You cannot have peoples living together if they don't communicate. And the only way to do that is to come out of isolation and work together.
The priest at the Episcopal Cathedral here remembered the words of Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II. If we will not devise a more equitable system than war, the general said, Armageddon will be at our doors. But the words that echoed longest after the prayer service was over were the ones that came at the very end. Words most in the church had learned from childhood, but in a now and forever less innocent world, words whose meaning will never be quite the same. Jim Bitterman, CNN, Paris.
You know, Jim, we've seen so much emotion around the globe on this event. We've seen it in British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Russian President Vladimir Putin. We've seen it in just people who live in countries where they face terrorism, understanding this perhaps on a level that the rest of us just don't.
And let's pause for a minute. Let's take a look at some of the acts that were made around the world in response to all of this, and listen really to what people had to say.
I can only say that all those who have lost their lives, and indeed those who are related and have loved ones who've lost their lives, are very much in my thoughts and prayers.
I react to the families hearing the news, how their lives are never going to be the same. And I feel their pain. I saw that building collapse and I broke down in tears. I was just sobbing because this is pain. This is human suffering.
We are here to lay some wreaths, some flowers, and to also show our sympathy in action so that the American people understand the Palestinians are not their enemy.